I'm Ryan with Harlow Custom Microgreens, and today we're going to be working with some soil blocks. I had a lot of questions on my last video about what size to use and the different types of block makers and whatnot. I don't have a vast experience with them. I'll be the first to admit it. I've been using them for the last 3 seasons. I haven't tried the standing soil blocker. It's just not in my context. These are the blockers that we've been using. I started out, my very first one was this 2-inch 4-cell hand-powered one, and I found that it worked great. Pumped them out quickly, but the blocks were too big. Like, there was just too much block for what I was working with. It wasn't necessary. I did find that for pepper plants or squash plants or some of the cucurbits, it worked out pretty good. Things that I was going to transplant relatively small but needed some root space, it worked out well for that. But for like the kohlrabi, the fennel, lettuce transplants, things like that, it was too much block. Not efficient at all. So next I found a 5 blocker, and much improved as far as space goes. I could get 75 in one of these 10 by 20 trays. Much better sized for like bok choy and kohlrabi, fennel, things like that. Even works to an extent for your cauliflower and your kale and things like that. It was a pretty good foundation for those. And you could use the 4 blocker for the kale and broccoli and cauliflower, things like that, depending on how long you wanted to leave them in the greenhouse. The 4 would work, but 5 was more space efficient. Next, I found this little 20 cell 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch blocker, and I thought this would be a great solution for lettuce. Ultimately, I don't use it. I tried it 2 or 3 times with some different type plants like spinach and beets, just to get them jump started. I also tried it with lettuce. I didn't like the results. The cubes just don't come out very well in this one. And then just this year, we purchased the Johnny 12-cell blocker. You can see that it's built entirely differently. It's more of a press than it is a spring-loaded blocker like these, and there was a learning curve with it. There's some little tips and tricks that I'll pass on today, but as far as the blockers that I use, this is what we keep on hand. With that said, what do I use them for, right? So we'll start with the 12-cell. This fills a tray very nicely. It fits exactly all the way down, 6 sets of 12, 72 cells, and these are appropriately sized for starting a lot of our transplants. They're on the smaller side for broccoli, cauliflower, things like that, but they do work. I've had good results with it so far in getting those started. So with that said, when you're using the 12-cell, first thing you want to do is get it wet. We always keep water on hand. Your substrate that you're using in the bucket, your soil mix, it needs to be drier than what you would normally run it. In fact, mine is just a little too wet in this occasion, but we'll make it work. If your substrate is as dry as you would use, or as wet as you would use it for these spring-loaded blockers, it'll fall right out of the bottom. When you go to lift up the carriage and move it over, the soil mixture will just drop right out of the bottom because it's too slick or too wet, however you want to say that. Getting enough packed into the cell can sometimes be a little difficult because it likes to stick to the bottom of the tray. So before you lift it, give it a little wiggle. So let's get this one loaded. I've seen people use scrapers and knives and things like that to clean the mud off the top. Honestly, I've found my hands work best because I can push down on it, get some compression on those cells and get them loaded. And then before I pick it up, I just move it back and forth a little bit, clean off the sides, clean off the top, and then you can set it right in. Your top part, a little water to it, so you're going to set it in and give it a press down and give it a good squeeze. Lift up on the lower portion, and then before you move the top press, give it a little wiggle. That helps break loose all of the mud from these individual nipples that compress on the top. And this, some people online say, is faster than the hand presses. I am not quite certain that that's true. Like for me anyway, it might be for others, but with all the extra hand movements that you have to make and all the pressing, it's not as fast to me as the spring-loaded blockers are, and I'll show you that in a second. So we pick this up, pop it over there, give it a squeeze and lift, little wiggle on the top, pops right off, everything's good. You have to shimmy it side to side on the bottom, from what I've learned, on the bottom of the tray, so that the cells don't stick to the container, because when you lift it up, the pieces will stay behind. And the top wiggle is to break the nipples loose from the top of the cell so you don't lift off part of the cell with it. Both of those were problems that I ran into when I first started using it. The 72 cell is a great blocker. Just the learning curve is a little bit there, especially if you've been using the spring-loaded ones before. So I use the 5 blocker quite a bit. For me, I can just press it down through the substrate, wipe it off, drop it and go. Pop it in, give it a little pop. About every second or third time, wet it, wipe it off, and pop. One of the things that I will say is a benefit of the 72 blocker over the 5 is that you use both hands. So if you're doing a couple thousand of these in a day, your right arm doesn't get worn out, or your left arm, whichever hand is your dominant, doesn't get worn out. I can block with my non-dominant hand, it's just sloppy and not as quick. So you can see the size difference in the cubes, and when these are full, you'll have 13 rows here, and you can fit 2 extra sets on the side, gives you 75 total. When this one is set all the way down, you just have 72 cells. The other one that I'll show you is the 20 blocker. Like I said, it's a 3 by 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch cell, and it's supposed to be meant for lettuce. And just pop them out, and you can see how small those cubes are, how tight they are. The dimples in the top aren't very deep, they don't really make much of an impression, and it doesn't take much at all for top watering to make these disappear. So it's not something that we've come to use very much. In fact, this press will probably pass on here before long. But those are the different types of presses that we use and the different sizes that they produce. The 2-inch, same process, just larger cell. Like I said, we use it for cucurbits. Cucurbits don't like their roots messed with, so if you're going to transplant them, you have to be very careful with the roots. I found that the extra size on the 2-inch block really helps with that. We can get our yellowneck squash, our zucchini, cucumbers, all that stuff started early and transplant them out, and that 2-inch cube gives them more than enough room to get those roots established. Now, one of the questions that we get is, why don't we use cell trays? It has nothing to do with the dogma of plastic. We use more than enough plastic in our operation, unfortunately. It comes down to the fact that cell blocks, despite the labor up front to make them, are significantly faster and cleaner to transplant, and they give better transplants, in my opinion, in the end. Why do I say that? Is that there's a lot of root damage getting plants out of the cell trays. Sometimes you tear roots, sometimes you get half a cell out of it. If you run them too dry, it takes them a while for the plant to recover from the transplant. And generally what we have seen is anytime we transplant from a cell, a plastic cell, we have transplant shock, and the plants lose a couple of days while they get their footing and take off. When we use cell blocks, we have almost no transplant shock whatsoever. You're taking a chunk of soil, setting it inside of a chunk of soil, put some water on it, and off it goes. So we see that recovery, or no recovery necessary, so the plant takes off faster. We see a stronger transplant going in, and we're able to put just a little bit of nutrient in the soil block before it ever hits the field to help it get going, but also have a little energy pack with it as it gets delivered to the field. We also deliver a few other things to the field, such as mycorrhiza and azomite. We mix all that into the soil blocks before they get made. We also add in a little bit of nitrogen, just a little bit. If you look online, everybody has a different recipe. I've seen some really complicated ones that involve some biochar, compost, peat, various different amendments, and all of that going into this mix in this very complex recipe. I've tried a couple. I really don't see a huge difference between what that produced and what we produce immediately. Down the road 5 or 6 years, maybe there might be a difference. I'm not sure. We'll have to see. But immediately, I don't see a whole lot of difference in the quality or output of our transplants or in the plant in the end. So we still stick with a very basic recipe of a little bit of nitrogen, a little bit of azomite, and our base soil mix. Wet it all up, pop out your blocks, and seed it in. One of the finishing techniques that we use, depending on the seed, we'll either use crushed vermiculite or we just use another layer of peat, water it in. Make sure that you have a good starting temperature inside. This time of year for us works best because we can keep it a stable temperature until they pop. After they're all germinated, we give them an extra 4 or 5 days under lights and then move them on out to the greenhouse, and they'll sit there for another maybe 2 to 3 weeks before we get them transplanted, depending on the varieties. We plant a lot of different stuff, so there's not a one-size-fits-all recipe of method of handling. But in a nutshell, that's the different types of soil blockers that we use. It's my basic review of the Johnny 12 cell blocker for this year. It has its place. It produces a decent cell. It's just the learning curve is a little weird. Next year we plan to add the 200 cell Swift blocker to our operation, and the reason that I would want to add something like that is we can do all of our lettuce starts in a single sheet in maybe 1.5 instead of needing 3 or more in order to get enough cells to get it right. Lettuce just doesn't require a huge block to get it transplanted. Bok choy really doesn't need a huge block, other than once it sprouts you have less time to get it transplanted before it becomes entwined in a cluster. But there's a few other things that we could use it for, the 200 cell blocker, and be comfortable with it. But it seems to work very much the same as the Johnny's. You put your blocker in the tray, you pack it with soil, use lift and pop, and you have 200 trays in a single shot. One farmer said he could do a whole tray in about 90 seconds. I know that with my 5 cell, it takes me around a minute and a half, 2 minutes to fill 75 cells in a tray, and that's if I'm really hustling. You can't maintain that pace all day though. From what I've seen with the Swift blocker, you could probably easily maintain that pace, and with the 12 cell, because you're using 2 hands, the wear and tear isn't as bad on your forearms or on your arms during the day. And like I said, I haven't played with the 36 cell standing blocker simply because it's so expensive. And I don't know that I would want to work my trays on the ground. I prefer to work at waist level or somewhere in this range. I can see a little bit better. It's just, to me, it seems to work a little better. I understand that this standing blocker has its place though. If you have any experience or further tips with the Johnny 12 cell blocker, drop them in there. Let me know what you think. I'm very curious how others are receiving it. I did see a forum discussion on it on the Market Garden group, and there were a lot of positive reviews with it. People seem to really like it, which was one of the reasons that I got it. Like I said, the 5 cell I like for the smaller blocks. Bok choy and lettuce are great examples of that. The 72 does great for cabbages, broccolis, cauliflowers, things like that. And then the 4 cell 2-inch blocker, anything that you're going to leave in the cell for a long period of time is a great start, and your cucurbits. So anything that's root sensitive does pretty good in those. But that's a recap of what we use and how we do it. I hope you've enjoyed, and you come back to see us again. Leave a comment if you got any questions.